The blizzard hit Yankton, South Dakota, with such ferocity that Violet Turner could barely see her own hands in front of her face, and she knew with a sinking certainty that she was going to die out here in the frozen wasteland if help did not come soon. It was February 1878, and the winter had been brutal beyond anything the 22-year-old woman had experienced in her 3 years living on the frontier. She had been foolish to venture out alone, but the general store owner had promised her that the weather would hold for another few hours, just long enough for her to make the trip to the Henderson ranch to deliver the medicine old Mrs. Henderson desperately needed for her pneumonia. Now, huddled beneath an outcropping of rock with her horse lying dead 50 yards back, Violet could feel the cold seeping into her bones despite the layers of wool and fur she wore. Her fingers had long since gone numb, and she could no longer feel her toes inside her boots. The wind howled like a living thing, battering against her makeshift shelter with relentless fury. She had tried to keep moving, knowing that to stop meant death, but exhaustion had finally claimed her. Her eyes grew heavy despite her terror, and she found herself thinking of her mother back in Boston, of the life she had left behind when she followed her late husband west 3 years ago. Thomas had promised her adventure and a new beginning, and she had gotten both, though not in the way she had imagined. He had died of cholera 6 months after they arrived, leaving her alone with nothing but a small homestead and a fierce determination to survive. The townspeople had warned her repeatedly about traveling alone. "You will freeze to death out there," Martha Reynolds had said just last week, shaking her head with that mixture of pity and judgment that Violet had come to know so well. "A woman alone has no business trying to make it on the frontier. You should go back east where you belong, find yourself a nice, settled life." But Violet had refused. She had built something here, had created a life for herself delivering supplies and medicine to the scattered homesteads around Yankton. She was known as reliable, as brave, as someone who would ride through almost any weather to help a neighbor in need. That reputation had meant everything to her, had given her purpose and pride. Now, as the cold threatened to claim her, she wondered if that pride had been her downfall. She must have drifted into unconsciousness because the next thing she knew, she was being shaken roughly, and a deep voice was cutting through the howl of the wind. "Madam, can you hear me? Stay with me now." Violet forced her eyes open, though the effort felt monumental. Through the swirling snow, she could make out the shape of a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by a thick scarf and the brim of his hat. He was already stripping off his heavy coat, and before she could protest, he was wrapping it around her, adding its warmth to her own insufficient layers. "No," she managed to croak out through chattering teeth. "You will freeze." "Not on my watch," he said firmly, and there was such absolute certainty in his voice that she almost believed him. "And you are not freezing either, not if I have anything to say about it. Can you stand?" "I do not think so," Violet admitted, hating the weakness in her voice. Without another word, the stranger scooped her up into his arms as though she weighed nothing at all. Through the fog of her hypothermia, Violet was distantly aware of how strong he was, how easily he carried her through the driving snow. She could see now that he had a horse, a massive bay gelding that stood patient despite the storm. And somehow the man managed to get both of them into the saddle, settling her in front of him and wrapping his arms around her to keep her secure while he took up the reins. "There is a line shack about a mile from here," he said, his breath warm against her ear. "We can shelter there until the storm passes. Just hold on." Violet tried to respond, but the words would not come. Instead, she let herself lean back against the solid warmth of the stranger's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat through the layers of clothing between them. The ride that followed blurred into a haze of white and cold and the constant motion of the horse beneath them. She drifted in and out of awareness, always anchored by the strong arms holding her in place and the low, steady voice in her ear, telling her to stay awake, to keep fighting, to hold on just a little longer. When they finally reached the line shack, Violet was barely conscious. She had a vague impression of being carried again, of the blessed relief of being out of the wind, and then she was being laid down on something soft. The stranger was moving with swift efficiency, and she could hear the sounds of him working, the strike of a match, the crackle of a fire beginning to catch. "We need to get you out of these wet clothes," he said, and there was nothing improper in his tone, only practical concern. "Your dress is soaked through, and keeping it on will only make you colder. I will turn my back, but you need to change into something dry." Through the haze, Violet tried to make her frozen fingers work, but they would not obey. She fumbled uselessly at the buttons of her dress, tears of frustration beginning to leak from her eyes. "I cannot," she whispered. "I cannot feel my hands." She heard him curse softly, and then he was kneeling beside her. "I am going to help you," he said quietly. "I give you my word as a gentleman that I will be as respectful as possible, but we do not have a choice. Do you understand?" Violet managed a small nod, and she closed her eyes as she felt him begin to work at the buttons of her dress. True to his word, he was swift and impersonal, averting his eyes as much as possible while he peeled the wet layers away from her shivering body. He wrapped her in what felt like every blanket in the cabin, then added his own dry shirt and an extra pair of wool socks that were far too large for her feet. Through it all, he maintained a steady stream of conversation, telling her about the weather, about his horse, about anything and everything except the intimacy of the situation. Once she was bundled and dry, he turned his attention to building up the fire, coaxing the flames higher until blessed warmth began to fill the small space. The line shack was crude but solid, designed to shelter cowboys during the harsh Dakota winters. There was a small stove, a pile of firewood, and a few basic supplies. It was not much, but it was enough. "Better?" he asked, once the fire was roaring and he had positioned her as close to it as safety allowed. "Yes," Violet managed, and her voice sounded stronger now, more like herself. "Thank you. You saved my life." "Just doing what any decent person would do," he said, but she could hear the relief in his voice. He pulled up a crate to sit on, positioning himself close enough to tend the fire but far enough away to give her space. For the first time, with the light of the flames illuminating his face, Violet could see what he looked like. He was younger than she had initially thought, probably no more than 25 or 26, with strong features tanned by years of outdoor work. His hair was dark, almost black, and curled slightly where it brushed against his collar. His eyes were a striking pale blue, startling against his sun-darkened skin, and there was a small scar cutting through his left eyebrow. He was, she realized with a strange flutter in her chest, quite handsome. "I am Violet Turner," she said, because it seemed important to establish some normalcy, some civility in the strange intimacy of their situation. "Yates Fletcher," he replied, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. "I run cattle for the Double R Ranch about 10 miles east of Yankton." "I know the Double R," Violet said. "I have delivered supplies there a few times. I do not think I have seen you before, though." "I have only been in the area for about 8 months, Yates explained. "Came up from Texas after the war ended and spent some time drifting before I settled here. The foreman at the Double R is an old friend, and when he offered me steady work, I figured it was time to put down roots. What were you doing out in this storm?" Violet asked, curiosity beginning to overcome her exhaustion. Yates looked slightly sheepish. Checking on some cattle that wandered off from the main herd. The boss told me to leave it until the storm passed, but I had a feeling something was wrong. Turns out I was right, though not in the way I expected. Found you instead of the cattle. I am glad you did not listen to him, Violet said quietly. If you had not come along when you did, I would have frozen to death out there. What were you doing out in this weather? Yates asked, and there was no judgment in his voice, only genuine curiosity. Forgive me for saying so, but it does not seem like the kind of day for a pleasure ride. Violet explained about Mrs. Henderson and the medicine, about her determination to help despite the threatening weather. As she spoke, she watched Yates's expression shift from curiosity to concern to something that might have been admiration. That was a brave thing you did, he said when she finished. Foolish, maybe, but brave. Everyone in town told me I would freeze alone out here, Violet admitted, pulling the blankets more tightly around herself. They said a woman has no business trying to survive on the frontier by herself. With all due respect to the people of Yankton, Yates said, that sounds like nonsense to me. I have known plenty of strong frontier women in my time. My own mother ran our ranch in Texas for 5 years after my father died, and she did a better job of it than he ever had. Strength is not about whether you wear trousers or a dress. The simple validation of his words brought unexpected tears to Violet's eyes. She blinked them back quickly, but not before Yates noticed. His expression softened, and he reached out as though to comfort her before seeming to think better of it, his hand dropping back to his lap. You should try to get some rest, he said gently. The storm sounds like it is getting worse, and we might be here for a while. I will keep the fire going and keep watch. You need to rest too, Violet protested. You must be exhausted. I will rest later, Yates promised. Right now, making sure you are warm and safe is more important. Violet wanted to argue, but the truth was that she was utterly spent. The warmth of the fire and the security of the shelter were making her eyelids droop, and the adrenaline that had been keeping her alert was finally fading. She let herself sink down into the pile of blankets, and within moments, she was asleep. She woke several times throughout the night, always to find Yates still awake, tending the fire or checking the storm's progress through the small window. Each time, he would notice her stirring and offer quiet reassurance that everything was all right, that she should go back to sleep. There was something deeply comforting about his presence, about the steady competence with which he cared for them both. When Violet finally woke fully, pale morning light was filtering through the window, and the howling of the wind had finally ceased. She sat up carefully, her body stiff and sore but blessedly warm. Yates was at the stove, heating something that smelled wonderful. "Good morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder with a smile. "How are you feeling?" "Much better," Violet said, and it was true. Her fingers and toes ached with returning sensation, but the dangerous numbness was gone. "Is the storm over?" "Just ended about an hour ago," Yates confirmed. "Left us with about 3 feet of new snow, though, so travel is going to be slow. I found some coffee and beans in the supplies here. It is not fancy, but it is hot." He brought her a tin cup of coffee and a plate of beans, and Violet accepted them gratefully. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it was exactly what she needed. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before Violet remembered her state of undress beneath the blankets. "My clothes," she said, feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "Are they dry?" "Not yet," Yates said, carefully keeping his gaze averted. "I have them hanging near the fire, but wet wool takes time. I figure we will give it another hour or so, then start heading back to town. My horse can carry us both, and going slow and steady, we should make it by early afternoon." The thought of spending several more hours in Yates's company caused that same strange flutter in Violet's chest. She told herself it was simply gratitude, natural appreciation for the man who had saved her life. But as the morning wore on and they talked, she began to suspect it might be something more. Yates was easy to talk to, with a dry sense of humor and a way of listening that made Violet feel truly heard. He told her about growing up in Texas, about learning to ride almost before he could walk, about the pain of losing his father to a Comanche raid when he was 15. She shared her own story, about her comfortable childhood in Boston, about falling in love with Thomas and following him west despite her family's objections, about the grief and determination that had carried her through the last 2.5 years alone. "You ever regret it?" Yates asked. "Coming west, I mean, given how things turned out." Violet considered the question carefully. "I regret that Thomas died," she said slowly. "I regret that we did not have more time together, but I do not regret coming west. This place has changed me, made me stronger than I ever knew I could be. I like the person I have become here." "I can understand that," Yates said. "The frontier has a way of showing you who you really are, for better or worse." When her clothes were finally dry enough to wear, Yates stepped outside to give her privacy to dress. Violet winced as she pulled on the still damp garments, but they were bearable now. She emerged from the lined shack to find Yates checking the saddle on his horse, the morning sun bright on the fresh snow. The world had been transformed overnight. Everything was white and pristine, beautiful in its way despite the danger it represented. Violet could see her own horse's body in the distance, a dark mound beneath the snow, and grief tightened her throat. She had raised that mare from a foal. "I am sorry about your horse," Yates said quietly, following her gaze. "When the weather improves, I will come back and see to her properly." "Thank you," Violet managed. Her name was Daisy. The ride back to Yankton was slow and careful, the big bay gelding picking his way through the deep snow with patient determination. Violet sat in front of Yates again, acutely aware of every point where their bodies touched, of the strength of the arms bracketing her on either side. They did not talk much during the journey, saving their energy for the challenging conditions, but the silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. It was mid-afternoon by the time the buildings of Yankton came into view, and Violet felt a confusing mixture of relief and disappointment. She was eager for the comfort and safety of her own home, but she was not ready for this strange interlude with Yates to end. The arrival of a cowboy carrying a half-frozen woman into town caused quite a stir. People emerged from buildings despite the cold, calling out questions and exclamations. Yates ignored them all, heading straight for the boarding house where Violet rented a room. Mrs. Patterson, the landlady, came rushing out, her face a mask of concern. "Violet Turner, we thought you were dead. When you did not return last night and the storm hit, we were sure you had frozen to death out there." "I nearly did," Violet admitted. "If Mr. Fletcher had not found me, I would have." "Get her inside and warmed up," Yates said, helping Violet down from the horse. "She needs hot food and rest." Mrs. Patterson immediately took charge, ushering Violet toward the door. Violet turned back, suddenly desperate not to let Yates simply ride away. "Will I see you again?" she asked, and she did not care that her voice was too eager, too hopeful. Yates's face softened into a smile. "Count on it," he said. "I will come check on you in a few days, make sure you are recovering all right." It had to be enough. Violet let herself be led inside, but she looked back over her shoulder until Yates and his horse disappeared around a corner. The next few days passed in a blur of rest and recovery. The doctor examined Violet and declared that she had been extraordinarily lucky, suffering only minor frostbite on a few fingers and toes that would heal completely with time. Mrs. Henderson sent a note of gratitude, delivered by her son, explaining that she had received medicine from the town doctor and was on the mend. The whole incident might have faded into just another frontier survival story, except that Violet could not stop thinking about Yates Fletcher. She found herself watching the street from her window, hoping to catch a glimpse of him. She asked casual questions about the Double R Ranch, learning that it was one of the more successful operations in the area, known for fair treatment of its workers and good quality cattle. But she did not see Yates, and as days turned into a week, she began to fear that his promise to check on her had been merely polite words, easily forgotten. Then, on a bright Saturday morning, Mrs. Patterson knocked on her door. "You have a visitor, dear. That cowboy who saved you." Violet's heart leaped. She checked her reflection quickly, smoothing her hair and pinching color into her cheeks, before forcing herself to descend the stairs at a sedate pace, rather than the run her body wanted to make. Yates was waiting in the boarding house parlor, his hat in his hands, looking slightly uncomfortable in the feminine space with its delicate furniture and lace curtains. His face brightened when he saw her, and he stood quickly. "Miss Turner," he said formally, then seemed to relax a bit. "Violet. You are looking well." "I am feeling well," she said, crossing to him. "Thanks to you. Please, sit down." They settled into chairs near the window, and for a moment the easy conversation they had shared in the line shack seemed to have deserted them both. Violet found herself suddenly nervous, hyper-aware of how handsome Yates looked in his clean shirt and pressed trousers, his dark hair still damp from what must have been a recent bath. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," Yates said finally. "And to let you know that I took care of your horse. She is buried properly with a marker." Tears pricked Violet's eyes at his thoughtfulness. "That means a great deal to me, thank you." "I also wanted to ask," Yates continued, and now he looked nervous, his fingers turning his hat brim round and round, "if you might like to have dinner with me sometime. There is a decent restaurant in town, or if you would prefer something more proper, we could arrange for a picnic with a chaperone. I know we met under unusual circumstances, but I would like to get to know you better, if you are amenable." Joy flooded through Violet, so intense it was almost painful. "I would like that very much," she said. "And I do not think we need a chaperone. I am a widow, not an unmarried girl, and we are on the frontier, not in a Boston drawing room." Yates's answering smile was brilliant. "Dinner tomorrow night, then. I could pick you up at 6. "That would be perfect," Violet agreed. The next 24 hours seemed to crawl by. Violet spent an embarrassing amount of time agonizing over what to wear, finally settling on her best dress, a deep green wool that brought out the color of her eyes. When Yates arrived promptly at 6, she was ready and waiting, too excited to pretend at coyness. The restaurant Yates had chosen was simple but clean, run by a German family known for their hearty food and generous portions. Over plates of schnitzel and potatoes, Violet and Yates fell back into the easy conversation they had shared in the line shack. They talked about everything and nothing, about their hopes and dreams, their pasts and their possible futures. Violet found herself laughing more than she had in years, found herself leaning forward eagerly to catch every word Yates spoke. When he walked her home after dinner, he stopped at the boarding house door and took her hand gently in his. "I had a wonderful time tonight," he said quietly. "May I call on you again?" "I would be disappointed if you did not," Violet replied honestly. Yates raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles that sent warmth flooding through her entire body. "Until next time, then." Over the following weeks, Yates became a regular fixture in Violet's life. He came into town whenever his work allowed, which was usually twice a week, and they spent every possible moment together. They took walks through the snow-covered streets, attended church services together, and shared meals at the restaurant or in Mrs. Patterson's parlor. With each meeting, Violet found herself falling deeper, and the feeling appeared to be mutual. Yates was unlike any man Violet had ever known. He was strong and capable, yes, but also gentle and thoughtful. He listened to her opinions as though they mattered, asked for her thoughts on everything from politics to poetry. He made her laugh with his dry wit, and he made her feel safe in a way she had not felt since Thomas died. More than that, he made her feel alive, aware of possibilities she had thought were closed to her forever. One evening in late March, as they walked along the banks of the Missouri River, watching the ice begin to break up with the coming of spring, Yates stopped and turned to face her. "Violet, I need to tell you something," he said, and there was a seriousness in his voice that made her heart skip. "These past 2 months, getting to know you, spending time with you, it has been the best part of my life. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever met, and I find myself thinking about you constantly." "I think about you too," Violet whispered, her heart hammering in her chest. "I know we have not known each other very long," Yates continued, reaching out to take both of her hands in his. "But I am certain of my feelings. I love you, Violet. I love your strength and your kindness and your courage. I love the way you laugh and the way you challenge me to be better. I love you, and I want to build a life with you if you will have me." Tears were streaming down Violet's face now, but they were tears of joy. "I love you too," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "I have loved you since that day in the line shack, when you wrapped me in blankets and promised that I would not freeze. You saved my life, Yates, and then you gave me a reason to live it fully again." Yates pulled her into his arms, and Violet went willingly, lifting her face for the kiss she had been dreaming about for weeks. When his lips met hers, it was everything she had hoped for and more, tender and passionate and full of promise. She felt tears on her cheeks, though she could not say if they were his or hers, and she did not care. All that mattered was this moment, this man, this love that had caught her by surprise and changed everything. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Yates rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said. "I know I should probably ask more properly, should give you time to consider, but I cannot wait. Marry me, Violet. Let me spend the rest of my life loving you." "Yes," Violet said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." They were married 6 weeks later, in the small church in Yankton on a beautiful May morning. The whole town turned out for the wedding, including the rancher who owned the Double R and all the cowboys who worked there. Mrs. Patterson cried through the entire ceremony, and even the usually gruff minister seemed to have something in his eye as he pronounced Yates and Violet husband and wife. Violet had worried briefly about what married life would look like, given that Yates lived in the bunkhouse at the Double R and she had her room at the boarding house. But Yates had a solution already planned. He had been saving his wages carefully since coming to Dakota, and he had enough to make a down payment on a small piece of land about 5 miles from town. It was not much, just 40 acres with a creek running through it, but it was theirs. The rancher at the Double R, a generous man named Robert Reynolds, gave them a pair of milk cows as a wedding present and offered Yates a deal. Yates could continue working for the Double R while building up his own herd, using Reynolds's bulls to breed his cows in exchange for a percentage of the calves. It was a generous arrangement, one that would allow them to establish their own ranch while maintaining steady income. Their first year of marriage was hard work, but filled with joy. Yates and Violet lived in a small soddy while they saved money to build a proper house, and Violet learned to love the simplicity of their life together. She kept a garden and raised chickens, continued taking on occasional jobs delivering supplies to help supplement their income, and slowly but surely, they built something solid and real. The intimacy of married life was a revelation to Violet. Her marriage to Thomas had been affectionate but brief, cut short before they really had time to build deep roots. With Yates, everything felt different, deeper. She loved the way he would pull her close at night, the way he would seek her out during the day for a quick kiss or a shared smile. She loved watching him work, the easy competence of his movements as he built fences or tended cattle. She loved the conversations they had in the evenings, sitting together and watching the sun set over their land, planning their future and dreaming out loud. By their first anniversary, Violet was pregnant, and Yates was beside himself with joy. He became almost comically protective, trying to prevent her from doing any heavy work and fretting over her constantly. Violet found it endearing even when it was frustrating, and she made sure to reassure him regularly that she was healthy and strong. Their son was born in February of 1880, during another winter storm, though this one was nowhere near as severe as the blizzard that had brought Violet and Yates together. Yates held Violet's hand through the long labor, murmuring encouragement and wiping her brow, and when the baby finally emerged with a lusty cry, the look on his face was one of pure wonder. "A boy," the midwife announced, placing the squalling infant on Violet's chest. "A healthy baby boy." Violet looked down at her son, at his tiny perfect features and shock of dark hair, and felt her heart expand in ways she had not known were possible. Yates leaned over them both, one large hand gently cradling the baby's head, and Violet saw tears tracking down his cheeks. "He is beautiful," Yates whispered. "You are both beautiful. Thank you, Violet. Thank you for this gift." They named him Thomas Yates Fletcher, honoring both Violet's first husband and his father, and from the very beginning he was the light of their lives. Yates was a devoted father, spending every free moment with his son, singing to him and talking to him and carrying him around the ranch as soon as he was old enough. As Tommy grew, the ranch grew with him. Yates proved to have an excellent eye for cattle, and their herd steadily expanded. 3 years after Tommy was born, they were finally able to build the house they had been dreaming of, a sturdy frame structure with real glass windows and a wood floor. It was not fancy by Boston standards, but to Violet, it was a palace. Their daughter, Sarah, was born when Tommy was 4, and then 2 years after that came another son, whom they named James. The house that had seemed so spacious when they built it began to feel crowded, but it was a good kind of crowded, full of life and laughter and love. Violet sometimes thought back to that day in the blizzard, to how close she had come to dying alone in the cold. The people of Yankton had told her she would freeze, had predicted her death with grim certainty. But Yates had ridden up and changed everything with 4 simple words: "Not on my watch." He had saved her life that day, but more than that, he had given her a life worth living, a future full of love and family and purpose. The years passed in the way they do on the frontier, marked by seasons and harvests, by births and deaths, by hard work and small triumphs. Tommy grew into a strong young man who loved the ranch as much as his father did. Sarah proved to have her mother's independent spirit and her father's skill with horses. James was the scholar of the family, always with his nose in a book when he was not doing his chores. Violet continued to be involved in the community, helping neighbors when they needed it, though she never again ventured out alone in threatening weather. She and Yates became pillars of the growing town, known for their generosity and their strong marriage. People would point to them as an example of what frontier life could be at its best, of how love and hard work could build something lasting. On their 25th wedding anniversary, Yates surprised Violet with a trip back to the line shack where they had weathered the storm together. It was still standing, still maintained by the double R for emergencies, though it looked smaller and more rustic than Violet remembered. "I wanted to come back here," Yates said as they stood in the doorway, looking at the simple interior. "This is where everything began for us. This is where I realized that I wanted to spend the rest of my life making sure you were safe and warm and happy." Violet turned to her husband, seeing the gray threading through his dark hair, the lines that years of outdoor work had etched into his handsome face. He was 51 now, and she was 48, and they were no longer the young people who had met in a blizzard. But the love between them had only grown stronger with time, deepening into something rich and unshakable. "You have kept that promise," she said softly, reaching up to cup his face in her hand. "Every single day you have kept that promise. You saved me, Yates, in more ways than you will ever know." "We saved each other," Yates corrected, pulling her close. "I was drifting before I met you, Violet. I had no real purpose, no reason to build something lasting. You gave me that. You gave me everything." They stood there together, holding each other in the place where their story had begun, and Violet felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. This was what she had been searching for when she came west all those years ago, though she had not known it at the time. Not just survival, not just adventure, but this profound connection, this partnership, this love that had weathered every storm life could throw at it. As they rode back to their ranch, Violet thought about the path that had led her here. If that blizzard had not hit, if Yates had not been checking on his cattle that day, if any one of 100 small details had been different, they might never have met. But somehow, against all odds, they had found each other in the vastness of the frontier, and they had built a life together that was richer than any treasure. The ranch continued to prosper. By the time Yates and Violet celebrated their 30th anniversary in 1909, they had one of the most successful cattle operations in the region. Tommy had married a local girl, the daughter of a neighboring rancher, and they had given Violet and Yates 4 grandchildren. Sarah had shocked everyone by going east to attend college, one of the first women from the region to do so. And she had come back with a degree in teaching and plans to open a school. James had become a lawyer, practicing in Yankton and making a name for himself as an advocate for small ranchers and homesteaders. Violet and Yates were able to take a step back from the day-to-day running of the ranch, leaving much of the work to Tommy and the hired hands. They spent their days in quieter pursuits, tending the garden, taking long rides across their land, and spoiling their grandchildren outrageously. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their house watching the sunset, their 4 grandchildren playing in the yard, Violet reached over and took Yates's hand. "You remember what you said to me that day in the blizzard?" she asked. "When I told you that you would freeze if you gave me your coat." "Not on my watch," Yates said immediately, his lips curving into a smile. "I said you were not freezing, not on my watch." "You have been saying that to me in 1,000 different ways for more than 30 years, Violet said, her voice thick with emotion. "Every time you have worked yourself to exhaustion to provide for our family. Every time you have held me when I was sad or scared. Every time you have stood beside me and faced whatever challenges came our way. You have been saying not on my watch with every action, every day." Yates turned to look at her, and the love in his eyes was as strong as it had been on their wedding day. "Because it is true," he said simply. "I will never let you face the cold alone, Violet, not as long as I have breath in my body." "I know," Violet said, leaning her head on his shoulder. "And I hope you know that the same is true for me. We keep each other warm, Yates. We keep each other safe. That is what love is." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching their grandchildren play and the sun paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The years had been kind to them, filling their lives with more blessings than Violet had ever dared to dream of, when she was a frightened widow trying to survive on the frontier. As the seasons continued to turn, Violet and Yates settled into the rhythm of their later years with grace. They were still active and healthy, still deeply involved in the lives of their children and grandchildren, but there was a peacefulness to their days now, a sense of having earned their rest. Sarah's school became a fixture in Yankton, educating a generation of frontier children and earning her a reputation as one of the finest teachers in the region. She married late, at 35, to a widower with 2 children of his own, and she proved to be as devoted a stepmother as she was a teacher. Violet watched her daughter with pride, seeing in Sarah the same determination and independence that had brought Violet herself west all those years ago. James's law practice continued to thrive, and he became involved in territorial politics, advocating for Dakota's statehood and for fair treatment of small farmers and ranchers. He married the daughter of a judge, a smart young woman who shared his passion for justice, and they had 3 children who kept Violet and Yates busy with visits and celebrations. But it was Tommy and his family who were closest, living on the ranch and working the land alongside the hired hands. Violet loved watching her son with his children, seeing the same patient kindness in him that Yates had always shown. The ranch would be in good hands when Yates and Violet were gone. Of that she was certain. The winter of 1912 brought another fierce blizzard to South Dakota, and as Violet watched the snow pile up outside their windows, she found herself thinking back to that day 34 years earlier when she had nearly died in the cold. She was 63 now, her hair silver and her body marked by the years of hard work, but her mind was still sharp and her spirit still strong. Yates found her standing at the window, watching the storm, and he came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on top of her head. "Thinking about the old days?" he asked. "Thinking about how lucky I am," Violet corrected, leaning back against him. "If that blizzard had not happened, if you had not been exactly where you were when you were, if any detail had been different, we might never have met. Our children would not exist, our grandchildren would not exist. It is strange to think about." "I do not believe in luck," Yates said quietly. "I believe in providence. I believe we were meant to find each other, Violet. I believe God sent that storm to bring us together." Violet turned in his arms, looking up at her husband. His hair was completely white now, and his face was deeply lined, but his pale blue eyes were as clear and kind as ever. He was 69 years old, and she loved him more than she had thought it possible to love another person. "Then I am grateful for that providence," she said softly. "Every single day, I am grateful." As the years continued to pass, Violet and Yates faced the inevitable challenges that came with aging. There were health scares and sorrows, including the death of Robert Reynolds, the rancher who had given Yates his start and been such a good friend to them both. There were world events that touched even their quiet corner of South Dakota, including the Great War that took so many young men from the area, though thankfully none of their grandsons were old enough to serve. Through it all, Violet and Yates remained each other's anchor and support. They had been married for 40 years when Yates suffered a heart attack while out checking on the cattle. Tommy found him and got him back to the house, and the doctor was able to stabilize him, but it was a stark reminder of their mortality. Violet barely left Yates's side during his recovery, sleeping in a chair next to their bed and monitoring his every breath. The fear of losing him was so intense it was physical, a constant ache in her chest. She had known for years that their time together was limited, that one of them would inevitably leave the other, but the reality of it was almost unbearable. "Stop fussing," Yates told her one afternoon, catching her hand as she tried to adjust his pillows for the 100th time. "I am not going anywhere yet. We have more time, Violet, I promise you." "You cannot promise that," Violet said, tears spilling down her cheeks despite her efforts to hold them back. "You cannot control these things." "Maybe not," Yates agreed, pulling her down to sit on the edge of the bed. "But I can tell you this. I am not ready to leave you yet. We have grandchildren to spoil and great-grandchildren to meet. I want to see what Sarah does with her school and whether James ends up running for state office like everyone keeps suggesting. I want to watch the ranch continue to grow under Tommy's leadership. I want more years of sitting on the porch with you, watching the sunset. So I am going to fight, Violet. I am going to fight to stay with you as long as I possibly can." And fight he did. Yates made a slow but steady recovery, following the doctor's orders with a discipline that surprised everyone. He was never quite as strong as he had been before the heart attack, but he was able to return to a modified routine, still involved in the ranch, but no longer doing the heavy physical work. They celebrated their 45th anniversary quietly, with just their immediate family gathered around them. It was a perfect day, full of laughter and love, and as Violet looked around the table at her children and grandchildren, she felt a profound sense of gratitude. This was what they had built together, she and Yates. Not just a successful ranch, not just a comfortable life, but a legacy of love that would continue long after they were gone. The years that followed were peaceful and sweet. Violet and Yates spent their days in quiet companionship, taking pleasure in simple things. They would sit together in the garden Violet had tended for decades, or take slow walks around the ranch, or spend evenings reading aloud to each other. Their great-grandchildren began to arrive, and there was no greater joy than holding those tiny babies and seeing the continuation of their family line. When Violet turned 70 in 1920, Yates organized a surprise party that brought together what seemed like half the county. There were speeches and toasts, and person after person stood up to talk about how Violet had helped them over the years, how her kindness and generosity had made a difference in their lives. Violet was overwhelmed, having never really thought of herself as remarkable, but Yates just smiled and squeezed her hand. "You see," he whispered, "you see how many lives you have touched. You are extraordinary, Violet Fletcher. You always have been." 2 years later, in the spring of 1922, Yates became ill again. This time, they both knew it was more serious. The doctor was frank with them, explaining that Yates's heart was simply wearing out, that there was nothing to be done except to make him comfortable and wait for the inevitable. Violet refused to accept it at first, raging against the unfairness of it, but Yates calmed her with gentle words and patient love. "We have had 44 years together," he reminded her. 44 years of love and partnership and joy. That is more than most people ever get, Violet. We have been so blessed." "I do not want it to end," Violet whispered, lying beside him in their bed, his hand clasped tightly in hers. "I do not know how to exist without you." "You are the strongest person I have ever known," Yates said, his voice weak but steady. "You survived out there in that blizzard when anyone else would have given up. You built a life for yourself after Thomas died. You will survive this too, even though I know it will hurt." "I only survived that blizzard because you found me," Violet reminded him through her tears. "No," Yates said firmly, using what little strength he had to turn his head and look at her. "You survived because you are a fighter, Violet. I just helped you along, and our children will help you now. You will not be alone." The end came peacefully, on a warm May morning with the windows open and birdsong drifting in. Violet was beside him, holding his hand, and their children and many of their grandchildren were gathered around. Yates looked at each of them, his eyes full of love, and then he turned to Violet. "Not on my watch," he whispered, and she understood that he was reminding her of his promise, the one he had kept faithfully for all their years together. He was telling her that he had done his best, had kept her warm and safe and loved for as long as he possibly could. "I love you," Violet said, her voice breaking. "I have loved you from that first moment, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Yates replied. "Always and forever." He closed his eyes then, and his breathing slowed and stopped. Violet felt the moment his spirit left, felt the terrible absence where his presence had always been. The grief was crushing, overwhelming, a physical pain that made it hard to breathe. But even through the agony, she felt a strange sort of peace. They had had 44 years of love, 44 years of partnership, and that was something to be grateful for even in the midst of loss. The funeral was one of the largest Yankton had ever seen. Yates Fletcher had been respected and loved throughout the region, and people came from hundreds of miles away to pay their respects. Violet sat through it all in a state of numb shock, accepting condolences and hearing story after story about how Yates had helped people over the years. In the weeks and months that followed, Violet learned to navigate a world without Yates in it. It was harder than anything she had ever done, harder even than surviving in the blizzard all those years ago. But she had her children and grandchildren, and she had the ranch that she and Yates had built together. She had memories and love and a legacy that would continue. She took to walking every day to the small family cemetery on the hill where Yates was buried, talking to him about the grandchildren and the ranch and whatever was on her mind. She found comfort in the routines they had established together, in tending the garden and watching the sunset from the porch. She found purpose in helping her children and in sharing stories about Yates with the great-grandchildren who had not known him well. Violet lived for another 12 years after Yates died, remaining active and engaged with her family until the very end. She was blessed with reasonably good health, maintaining her independence in the house she and Yates had built, though her children worried about her constantly. In the spring of 1934, at the age of 84, Violet caught pneumonia. She fought it for a while, but she was tired, and part of her was ready to go. She had lived a long and full life, had loved deeply and been loved in return. She had seen her children grow and prosper, had held great-great-grandchildren in her arms. She had built something lasting and good. On the night she died, surrounded by her children, Violet thought she could see Yates waiting for her. He looked young and strong the way he had been when they first met, and he was smiling. "Not on my watch," she whispered, and she meant it as a thank you, as a reminder of all the years he had kept that promise. Then she closed her eyes and let herself go, trusting that he would be there to catch her. At her funeral, Tommy stood up to speak about his mother. He talked about her strength and courage, about her kindness and generosity. But mostly, he talked about her love for Yates and Yates's love for her. "My parents had the kind of love that most people only dream about," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They met in a blizzard, under circumstances that should have been tragic, and they turned it into the beginning of a beautiful story. For 44 years, they were partners in every sense of the word, building a life and a family together. And now they are together again, and I have to believe they are somewhere peaceful, watching over all of us and still loving each other with that same intensity that defined their time on Earth." They buried Violet next to Yates on the hill overlooking the ranch, and the family gathered there often in the years that followed, telling stories and remembering. The ranch continued to prosper under Tommy's children, and then his grandchildren, and the Fletcher name became synonymous with integrity and hard work throughout the region. And sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind howled and the snow piled up outside, people in Yankton would tell the story of Violet Turner and Yates Fletcher. They would talk about the blizzard that brought them together, about the love that sustained them through decades of frontier life, about the legacy they left behind. It became a legend of sorts, a reminder that even in the harshest conditions, love could flourish. That even when people said you would freeze alone, sometimes a cowboy would ride up and change everything with 4 simple words: "Not on my watch." The story of Violet and Yates lived on, passed down through generations, inspiring others to believe in the possibility of finding love in unexpected places, of building something lasting despite the odds. And in a way, that meant they never really died at all. They lived on in the memories of their descendants, in the ranch that bore their mark, in the countless lives they had touched during their years together. Their great-great-grandchildren would walk the land that Violet and Yates had claimed, would live in houses built on the foundation they had laid, would carry forward the values they had instilled. And every winter, when the blizzards came and the world turned white and dangerous, someone in the family would remember the story of how it all began, of how love and determination had triumphed over the cold. The Fletcher Ranch stood for over 150 years, a testament to what 2 people could build when they had love and determination. Even as the world changed around it, as technology advanced and the frontier became tamed, the ranch remained, a piece of living history. In the early 21st century, the ranch was still in the Fletcher family, though it had evolved with the times. There were modern amenities now, and the work was done with machinery rather than by hand, but the core values that Violet and Yates had established remained. The land was still treated with respect, the cattle were still raised with care, and the family still gathered on the hill where Violet and Yates were buried, telling stories and remembering. On the headstone, worn now by more than a century of wind and weather, was a simple inscription that summed up their entire love story. Yates Fletcher, 1853–1922, and Violet Turner Fletcher, 1850–1934. They faced the cold together and built a love that warmed generations. Not on my watch. It was a promise kept, a love fulfilled, and a legacy that would endure as long as there were Fletchers to remember and carry the story forward. In a world that often felt cold and uncertain, it was a reminder that love could be the warmth that sustained you through any storm, that partnership could transform survival into something beautiful, and that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories began with the simplest act of kindness. Violet had been told she would freeze alone in that blizzard, had been written off as another casualty of the harsh frontier. But Yates had ridden up and refused to let that happen, had wrapped her in warmth and safety and eventually in love. Together, they had created something that transcended their individual lives, that touched countless others and rippled forward through time. That was the true magic of their story, the reason it continued to be told and retold. It was not just a tale of survival or even of love, though it was both of those things. It was a reminder that one person could make a difference, that one act of kindness could change the course of a life, that love could flourish even in the most unlikely circumstances. And so the story of Violet and Yates Fletcher lived on, a bright thread woven into the tapestry of frontier history, a testament to the power of love and the importance of refusing to let others face the cold alone. Their legacy was not just in the ranch they built or the children they raised, but in the reminder they left behind that sometimes, when everything seems lost, help arrives in unexpected forms, and that help can transform into something far greater than mere survival. It could become a love story for the ages, a partnership that would endure beyond death, a legacy that would warm hearts for generations to come. All because a cowboy rode up in a blizzard and made a simple promise, "Not on my watch," and then spent the rest of his life keeping it.